Jellybean Little and the Rice Pudding Thieves by Carol Donockley, read by Viv Moules. Chapter 1. Mr. and Mrs. Little were very, very happy when their son Jellybean was born. He had 2 arms, 2 legs, and they thought that he might have a head, but they couldn't quite be certain. Jellybean, you see, was neatly folded up like a concertina. "Quick," said the midwife, as she tried and failed to straighten Jellybean out. "You're going to have a right job feeding the poor mite if you ain't sure where his mouth is." Mr. Little, however, wasn't concerned. He knew about lots of things and was full of bright ideas. "Don't worry, my dear," said Mr. Little to his wife, who was getting a bit anxious. "We'll soon have him sorted. I'll just peg him out on the washing line. Mark my words, that'll do the trick." And it did. Jellybean blew in the wind, and as he wafted backwards and forwards, he began to unfold. Soon he was a bit longer than a long cucumber. Then he was a bit longer than a long baby. Then he was a bit longer than a long car. And still he kept unfolding. "What a shame," said the midwife. "He'd have made a great doorstop." Of course, Jellybean wasn't called Jellybean to start with. At first he was just called Baby. Then Mrs. Little suggested calling her son Margaret Rose Nellie Monkey Bundles. But Mr. Little wasn't too sure. He felt that Margaret Rose Nellie Monkey Bundles might be quite a nice name for a girl, but it was a bit boring for a boy. So the midwife had a think. Maybe they could name the baby after her old dad. "Well, yes," said Mrs. Little thoughtfully. "I suppose Smelly Feet Little does have a certain ring to it." Then Mr. Little came up with the most brilliant idea. "I think we should call him after something we like." So they made a list. It had a heading, Things We Like. 1. Watching the telly little. 2. Going for a walk little. 3. Creamy rice pudding little. 4. Bubble bath little. 5. Warm vest little. 6. Making a snowman little. 7. Paddling in the sea little. 8. Egg and spoon race little. 9. Black bottom cupcake little. And the midwife came up with the last one. Antibacterial bathroom wipes little. Said Mrs. Little. Difficult. Black bottom cupcakes were Mrs. Little's favourite cupcakes. She made them every second Wednesday. All gooey and chocolatey. The trouble was that bottom was often difficult for a boy to spell, and school teachers were always very fussy about spelling. What if the new baby missed out a T from bottom when he was writing his name? It would be spelled Botum. There'd be trouble at school. "No," said Mr. Little. "We can't risk that." All at once the new baby began to cry. His face went redder and redder and redder and redder. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Little. "What's the matter with him?" Mrs. Little was a new mother, you see, and new mothers always panic. "He's missing the washing line," said Mr. Little. So they carried him outside and used him as a clothes prop. And Mr. Little was right. As soon as they clamped the baby's gums around the washing line, he stopped crying. "That's better," said Mrs. Little, hanging out a huge load of washing. "He must like rocking backwards and forwards. Bless him. His face isn't as red as a jelly bean any more." Then suddenly she stopped hanging out the washing. And Mr. Little stopped watching Mrs. Little hanging out the washing. And the midwife, who wasn't really doing anything, just stopped. They all looked at each other. They'd forgotten their most favourite thing in the whole wide world. Strawberry-flavoured jelly beans. So that's what the new baby was christened. Strawberry-flavoured Jellybean Little. But they called him Jellybean for short. Mr. and Mrs. Little got a book from the library all about babies. It told them all sorts of interesting things, like when they should put Jellybean in his cot and when they should get him up. But for some strange reason, there didn't seem to be a chapter about where to put your baby for a nap if he was longer than 2 buses, Mrs. Little tried bending Jellybean, refolding Jellybean, and even squashing him, but the cot wasn't quite big enough. His legs always dangled over the side, spread through the bedroom doorway, wrapped round the banisters, and ended up halfway down the stairs. "This won't do," exclaimed a fireman one day as he unknotted Jellybean's legs for the 17th time. "We'll just have to drain the local swimming pool." So they did, but not everyone was happy. You see, it was difficult to dive in when there was no water in the swimming pool and the bottom was full of baby. They also had a bit of a problem with Jellybean's pram, until Mr. Little decided to make one from an old canal barge. Then he painted it mushy pea green, because he'd read that babies liked bright colours. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, Jellybean, much refreshed from his nap in the swimming pool, would set off with his parents for a long walk. Pushing the pram uphill was sometimes a teeny-weeny bit difficult, but hurtling back down again was always enormous fun. Mr. and Mrs. Little would hold on tight as Jellybean's mushy pea-green pram picked up speed. Then they'd jump on board and whoosh along. "Whee!" squealed Mrs. Little. "Whee!" squealed Mr. Little. "Whee!" squealed Jellybean. Jellybean absolutely loved his pram. There was a sort of roof which went over his head, and this was very useful for 3 reasons. Firstly, if it was hot and sunny, Jellybean was in the shade. Secondly, if it was blowy and rainy, Jellybean was cosy and dry. Thirdly, if he was still hungry after 42 bottles of baby milk and the odd plate of custard creams, Jellybean could reach out and help himself to a dozen of the tomatoes and the odd lettuce which Mr. Little grew in pots on the pram roof. The villagers would often stop what they were doing and wave as Jellybean and his mushy pea-green pram went by. Sometimes this was because they wanted to say hello. Sometimes this was because they wanted to buy a few of Mr. Little's tomatoes, and sometimes they just needed a bit of help from Jellybean to clean out the odd gutter. Having Jellybean around was much more convenient than using a ladder, and of course it saved the villagers an absolute fortune if they had a job which would have needed scaffolding. The village children, however, didn't come near. Now, you might be wondering how Jellybean and his legs fitted into the house. It wasn't easy, but Mr. Little had one of his bright ideas. "We'll bash a hole in the walls," explained Mr. Little, getting out his sledgehammer. Then, because Mr. Little was very polite and always considered others, he added, "Please go next door, dear, and have a word with Mrs. Grinchful. Ask her if we can bash through her walls as well." So Mrs. Little did, and Mrs. Grinchful was delighted with the idea, because Jellybean's legs would be perfect for resting the telly on. Mr. Grinchful, however, was a completely different matter. He was not at all delighted. "Messing up my living room with a spare pair of legs," he complained to anyone who'd listen. "I mean, they don't even match the new wallpaper." Then he wagged his finger at Mrs. Grinchful and said in a voice full of doom, "Mark my words, that Jellybean boy will bring nothing but trouble." Chapter 2. Your mother or your granny has probably told you that you're a growing boy. This is good because boys are supposed to grow. This is not good, of course, if you're a girl, in which case you need to make a sign and hang it round your ears. Make it stand out. Decorate it with glitter or your mother's favourite lipstick. It should say, "I am a girl, so there." Jellybean, who eventually stopped being a baby, was also a growing boy. To start with, he'd learned how to crawl, which was very useful, because his hair dusted the cobwebs from the ceiling. Then he'd learned how to walk, which was not so useful, because his head kept crashing through the ceiling and spoiling the plaster work. "We might have to move," said Mr. Little one day, but Mrs. Little didn't want to. She and Mrs. Grinchful had become great friends whilst chomping on cupcakes and watching the telly together on Jellybean's legs. Jellybean didn't want to move either. "I like it here," said Jellybean, as he shook the pieces of ceiling from his hair. So Mr. Little, who just happened to be good with cement, built an extension onto the house. Jellybean's bedroom was quite large, which was handy if anyone from the airport needed to store the odd plane, and if it was raining, Mrs. Little could ride her bike in it. One particular Sunday, Jellybean, who was now far too big for the washing line, was earning some pocket money blowing Mrs. Little's sheets dry because her tumble dryer had broken. "Oh, pooh, snankers," shivered Mr. Grinchful as one of Jellybean's blows came his way. Mr. Grinchful was in his vegetable plot, watering his prize-winning cabbages. "Oi, Jellybean!" he shouted. "Stop that right now and come here." "OK," Jellybean shouted back. Then he checked to see that the sheets were dry, and bending down, handed them to Mrs. Little through an upstairs window. "Can I go next door?" asked Jellybean excitedly. "I think Mr. Grinchful wants to play." "Are you sure, dear?" asked Mrs. Little doubtfully. "I think so," replied Jellybean, although he wasn't totally certain. You see, everybody except Mrs. Grinchful thought that Mr. Grinchful was the most boring man in the village, and boring people don't usually like to play. Mrs. Grinchful, however, thought her husband was the most boring man in the whole wide world. "Well, then of course," said Mrs. Little. "But don't forget to say please and thank you if you're offered rice pudding." "I won't," said Jellybean. "And remember," said Mrs. Little, who knew a lot about manners, "eating 92 tins is fine, but eating 93 would be a teensy bit greedy." This was the first time that Jellybean had ever been invited anywhere to play, so he decided to take his favourite toy with him. Mr. and Mrs. Little didn't have a lot of money, so the Jeep wasn't new, but that didn't matter to Jellybean. He was just glad that the army had wanted to recycle the Jeep after they'd finished driving around in it. But then disaster struck. Jellybean accidentally let go of his Jeep, and it crashed through the garden hedge, shot across Mr. Grinchful's lawn, and just missed the shed. Mr. Grinchful was very annoyed. "Sorry," gulped Jellybean, and then he stepped over what was left of the hedge into Mr. Grinchful's garden. "Thank you for inviting me to play," said Jellybean, as he carefully tried to avoid standing on the greenhouse. But Mr. Grinchful didn't want to waste time playing. He wanted Jellybean to pull 2 huge old apple trees out so that he'd got room to grow more cabbages. "Cabbages are much better than apples. I mean, you can cook them in lots of different ways. You can have lovely boiled cabbage, or you can boil your cabbage till it's lovely. Or—" Mr. Grinchful suddenly stopped talking about cabbages and squinted between Jellybean's legs. A snarling, barking black dog was coming slowly towards them, and it was frothing at the mouth with anger. "Keep very still," whispered Mr. Grinchful, "and maybe it'll go away." But the black dog had other ideas. Jellybean was absolutely terrified, and his whole body began to shake with fear. But then he remembered what Mr. Little had once said. "It's fine to be frightened, son. Everyone is frightened of something. All you have to do when you're frightened is concentrate on something else." So Jellybean concentrated on counting backwards from 100. Now, Jellybean was quite a clever boy. He was good at reading and loved writing stories, but he was pretty useless at maths. 100, 99... Jellybean couldn't remember what went next. Did he go to 98? Or if you were counting backwards, did he go back to 100? All of a sudden, Jellybean began to sway backwards and forwards in panic. The black dog was brushing against his foot. "Look at those fangs!" gulped Mr. Grinchful. Then the black dog gave a blood-curdling howl. "Ow!" and a wobbly Jellybean crashed to the ground. Fortunately, Jellybean missed Mr. Gringeful's cabbages. Unfortunately, however, he didn't miss Mr. Gringeful. "Mr. Gringeful! Mr. Gringeful, are you all right?" Jellybean, who wasn't in the habit of falling on people, gasped. "I think so," said a shocked Mr. Gringeful, as he slid out from under Jellybean's left knee. "But I feel a bit peculiar." "I'm really, really sorry," said Jellybean, as he checked anxiously around for the black dog. Thankfully, the garden was deserted, so Jellybean picked Mr. Gringeful up and posted him through the bathroom window, where Mrs. Gringeful was busy cleaning the bath. "Oh, Jellybean, don't you worry yourself," said Mrs. Gringeful, sticking her head through the window. "It'll make a nice change to have Mr. Gringeful shaped like a triangle for a while, because he won't be boring any more." Then Mrs. Gringeful hung Mr. Gringeful on the taps for a rest, and hurried back to the kitchen, where she had just finished opening the first tin of rice pudding for Jellybean. "That's strange," said Mrs. Gringeful, scratching her head. "This tin of rice pudding is empty, and I'm sure I didn't eat it. Oh, well, never mind. I've got plenty more." But Mrs. Gringeful was very wrong, because all her other tins of rice pudding had mysteriously disappeared. Chapter 3. The next day was a school day. Jellybean didn't have far to go to school. It was 9 strides, or 5 minutes if Mrs. Little went in the car. This was useful, because it meant that Jellybean didn't have to leave home terribly early. It also meant that he had time for a healthy breakfast of a bathful of porridge, 100 slices of toast spread with homemade marmalade, and 36 glasses of milk, before he cleaned his teeth with 2 tubes of toothpaste and set off for the day. Snitchy Pike Village School was quite ordinary. On the inside there were classrooms and a hall for assembly and school dinners. On the outside were a playground and a large playing field. At least Jellybean thought his school was ordinary. He'd never actually been properly inside. It had been a bit of a squeeze, you see, trying to get Jellybean's foot and the other children in at the same time. Miss Trentwood Dumbody Tootle Smith, the headmistress, had come to see Mr. and Mrs. Little when it was time for Jellybean to start school. She was quite a good headmistress, but like all teachers she was rather bossy. It wasn't that she always thought she was right. It was just that she knew everyone else was always wrong. "I'm terribly sorry," Miss Trentwood Dumbody Tootle Smith had apologised in a posh voice. "Jellybean cannot possibly come into school. We will have to educate him at home. I will personally set the work and come twice a week to mark it." Jellybean had been devastated. He'd heard all about school from the bedtime stories which Mr. Little read to him every night. School was fun. Children were supposed to put plastic spiders on their teachers' desks to frighten the living daylights out of them, and Jellybean knew all about PE. He'd been practising his hopping for months, and felt he'd easily be able to hop over the school roof when the teacher asked him. Mr. and Mrs. Little hadn't been happy either. "Jellybean needs to be with children of his own age," Mr. Little had said. "He needs to have friends and eat rice pudding for school dinner." "Yes," Mrs. Little had agreed, "with raspberry jam, so that he can swirl it around with his spoon and make it go all lovely and pink." Miss Trentwood Dumbody Tootle Smith had looked slightly shocked. She didn't approve of pink rice pudding. Pink was her least favourite colour. "We tend not to encourage swirling at Snitchy Pike School, particularly," she'd added, "in rice pudding." So the grown-ups had a think, and they came up with a plan. Mr. Little would help the teachers to put up a huge marquee for Jellybean outside the classroom window. That way he could take part in the lessons, and with the classroom window open, the other school children would get plenty of fresh air. Jellybean loved school. His teacher, now he was in year 2, was Miss Myrtle. She was halfway to 100, which was nearly ancient, but she was very kind. On this particular Monday morning, Miss Trentwood Dumbody Tootle Smith strode into the classroom just as Miss Myrtle had finished taking the register. "Tests are very good for you children," said the headmistress, as she looked around the shivering class and saw everyone wrapped up in their hats, coats, gloves and duvets because the window was wide open. "So I'm going to give you a mental arithmetic test." Then Miss Trentwood Dunbody Tootle-Smith hollered through the open window. "Jelly Bean, are you ready? I'm going to start with you first. What are 5 9s? Jellybean gulped anxiously. He was pretty certain that he knew what 9 5s were, but he hadn't a clue about 5 9s. Come on, said Miss Trentwood Dunbody Tootle-Smith, as she impatiently tapped her foot. "I haven't all day." Is it 27? asked Jellybean, hopefully. "No, of course it isn't," said Jellybean's headmistress, turning away from the open window. "Sydney, tell Jellybean what 5 9s are." Sydney Wink was a bit small for her age and had the desk next to the window. She was extremely good at maths, so of course she got the answer right. 5 9s were 45, which seemed strange to Jellybean because 9 5s were 45 as well. Jellybean hoped that someone else would be in his mental arithmetic test, but Miss Trentwood Dunbody Tootle-Smith seemed to have other ideas. "Jellybean, you have 7 chocolate cakes and 9 ginger cakes, and someone takes 2 of your chocolate cakes and 5 of your ginger cakes. How many cakes will you have left?" Jellybean beamed. He knew the answer to this one. It was an easy sum, but he counted on his fingers just to check. 7 and 9 is, let me see, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. I'd have 16 cakes. "Yes," sighed Miss Trentwood Dunbody Tootle-Smith. "You'd have 16 to start with, but what if someone took 2 of your chocolate cakes and 5 of your ginger cakes?" "Oh, I wouldn't let them," said Jellybean confidently. "I'd soon catch anyone who was rotten enough to be a cake stealer." The school children just looked at each other and smirked, but Jellybean didn't notice. "Mrs. Grinchful, who lives next door to me, makes really good ginger cakes," Jellybean continued. "They're my favourite, especially when they go all sticky on the top. I could bring one in for you tomorrow to eat at playtime if you like." "Really?" said Jellybean's headmistress, who would rather have had sherry trifle. And they're Mr. Grinchful's favourite too, although he'll have to sort of suck his cake now he's shaped like a triangle." Archibald Trumps, the captain of the school football team, began to pull faces at Jellybean. He was the sneakiest, meanest boy in the school, and everyone always did exactly what he told them to do. "People with ginormous feet," hissed Archibald Trumps, "are pea-brains." Now you'd think that Miss Trentwood Dunbody Tootle-Smith would have heard this, but she didn't. She was too busy helping Miss Myrtle, who unfortunately had got herself wedged upside down behind the bookcase whilst practising her handstands. Jellybean blushed. Archibald Trumps never, ever, ever said anything nice to anyone, except, of course, when he was talking to his reflection in the mirror. "Hey, I'm speaking to you, pea-brain," said Archibald Trumps, pointing a sneaky, mean finger at Jellybean. "I know," said Jellybean, who was feeling very hurt. The school children began to laugh, but Sydney didn't. She thought that laughing at Jellybean would be very rude, and she was not a rude girl. Anyway, she thought he was telling the truth about Mr. Grinchful. Miss Trentwood Dunbody Tootle-Smith wasn't rude either, but she was extremely cross. "Stop laughing, everybody, or Jellybean will continue to lie about his neighbour. A man shaped like a triangle indeed." "Please, miss," said Jellybean, quietly, because he was sad to think that his headmistress didn't believe him. "It's true. I sort of squashed Mr. Grinchful. But don't worry, it's probably not forever. Anyway, Mrs. Grinchful likes him being a triangle-shaped person because he isn't boring any more, and she can hang him on the coat stand now so he doesn't get under her feet." "What utter rubbish!" said Miss Trentwood Dumbody Tootlesmith, who liked to have the last word. "Triangles are always boring, and anyway, we don't say triangle-shaped, we say triangular." Then Miss Trentwood Dumbody Tootlesmith went for a snooze in the staff room to dream about huge bowls of creamy sherry trifle, which was a huge mistake, because she didn't see a black dog sneak into the playground, and she certainly didn't see an old dirty purple van lurking in the lane nearby. Chapter 4. It was raining at playtime, and Archibald Trumps was busy making fun of Jellybean. "Pea-brain is a liar, and he's got ginormous feet," chanted Archibald Trumps at the top of his nasty little voice. "I daren't go near him, 'cause he'll think I'm something to eat." Then Archibald Trumps told his classmates that they had better join in or else. Sidney Wink took no notice, but as usual the other children did. "Pea-brain is a liar, and he's got ginormous feet. We daren't go near him, 'cause he'll think we're something to eat." Jellybean didn't want to hear the hurtful rhyme, so he put his fingers in his ears and passed the time thinking of ways to make his feet shrink. Of course, being a bright boy, Jellybean knew that feet couldn't really be shrunk. Not like the yellow and purple jumper, which Mr. Little had been wearing when he discovered and accidentally eaten the last black-bottom cupcake. It was hidden under Mrs. Little's silk blouse in the ironing basket. Poor Mrs. Little had been a bit upset when she saw the crumbs around her husband's mouth, which is why she'd accidentally put Mr. Little's favourite jumper in the washing machine and boiled it. The yellow and purple jumper wouldn't even fit a starving flea after that. The first thing Jellybean tried was walking around on his tiptoes, but that didn't seem to make his ginormous feet look smaller. Then he took his fingers out of his ears, removed his shoes and socks, and curled his toes under. "That's better," said Jellybean happily as he looked down at his toeless feet. But then, of course, he had another thought. Archibald Trumps and the other children would probably think that people with toeless feet were lying pea-brains as well. "Oh, well," sighed Jellybean as he put his socks and shoes back on. "I might as well practise my hopping." But then he looked out of the marquee and changed his mind. Archibald Trumps had all the children lined up by a huge puddle, and was having great fun soaking them. Jellybean wondered how Archibald Trumps would feel if he and the other children were brave enough to soak him back. But Jellybean thought that would never happen. Now Mrs. Little was very sensible for a mother. She thought that growing boys and girls should always have a little snack at playtime. So Jellybean practised putting as many of the 5 dozen freshly baked maple pies in his mouth as he could, in one go. Maple pies were Jellybean's favourite. Mrs. Little had invented them. His record was 58, but Jellybean was certain he could do better if he tried, so he opened his mouth really wide and managed 59. Then he heard a little voice and saw a long Mac with a big hood. It was Sidney Wink. "Hello," said Sidney. "What are you doing?"
"Eating apple pies,"
explained Jellybean, through a mouthful of delicious mapley pastry. Sidney didn't know about maple pies, so Jellybean gave her the last one. "Are you okay?" asked Sidney Wink, who was a well-brought-up girl and never spoke with her mouth full. "You look a bit sad."
Probably,"
said Jellybean, who had also been taught not to speak with his mouth full, though sometimes he forgot. Then Jellybean sadly pointed to his feet and explained about being called a liar and pea-brains and wishing feet would shrink. "But I'm sure you were telling the truth," said Sidney Wink. "And your feet are the perfect size for you." Then she giggled. Imagine if I had your feet on me. They wouldn't fit. I suppose so, said Jellybean. Then he grinned at his new friend. And if I had your little feet on me, they wouldn't fit either. Exactly, said Sydney, who was good at maths, but also knew a lot about feet. Archibald Trumps doesn't know what he's talking about. Anyway, she added, I bet you've forgotten today's Monday, and that means rice pudding for school dinner. At 12 o'clock precisely, Miss Trentwood Dunbody Tootle-Smith held a special school assembly. I have some terrible news. She was looking very grave, which means serious, but more so. There will be no rice pudding for school dinner. Oh, no, said Miss Myrtle, who had been prized out from behind the bookcase and was extremely fond of rice pudding. In fact, continued Miss Trentwood Dunbody Tootle-Smith, there will be no rice pudding tomorrow either. Every tin has vanished from the school kitchen. Oh, no, said Miss Myrtle again. Then she fainted. It had stopped raining by 3:30, so Jellybean and Sidney Wink played a bouncing game on their way home from school. It was Sidney's idea. Jellybean had to hold out his jumper and toss Sidney up and down in it. What do you think has happened to the school rice pudding? Asked Sidney, as Jellybean tossed her higher than the school roof. I don't know, said Jellybean, but then he remembered something. He hadn't told Sidney about Mrs. Grinchful's rice pudding. That had disappeared too. So first it was Mrs. Grinchful's rice pudding, said Sidney, as she came down from an extra big bounce. And now it's the school's. Yes, said Jellybean, and then he had a thought. Sidney Wink lived with her Granny Bud at the village store, and the village store sold tins of rice pudding. Quick, Sidney, cried Jellybean as he caught Sidney and put her gently into his coat pocket. I think we need to warn Granny Bud, or her tins of rice pudding could go missing as well. Then they set off at a brisk pace for the village store. Everyone loved Granny Bud. She was very kind and helpful. No one had to spend hours deciding which chocolates had hard or soft centres, because Granny Bud did it for them. Chocolates with teeth marks had soft centres. Chocolates with a suck mark had hard centres. And Granny Bud's teeth were magic, because she could take them out and put them back in again. Jellybean had asked for magic teeth like Granny Bud's for Christmas, but he didn't get them. In no time at all they arrived at Granny Bud's store, and while Sidney hurried inside, Jellybean peered anxiously down the chimney. Granny Bud! Granny Bud, where are you? Called Sidney as she went from room to room, but there was no answer. Then Jellybean thought he heard something. It was just a faint sound, like a sob, and it seemed to be coming from Granny Bud's stockroom in the basement. Crouching down, Jellybean peered through the stockroom window. And what a shock he got! There were tins of peas and packets of biscuits and bottles of sauce all over the floor. And tied to a chair, in the middle of the mess, was Granny Bud. Chapter 5. We've got to do something, said Jellybean when the police had arrived. I know, said Sidney Wink, but what? Now, you've probably read books where the hero or heroine in an adventure easily comes up with a plan to catch some wicked criminals. Throw those books away, or give them to your arch-enemy. They're a load of rubbish. Lock-em-up Louis would know what to do, sighed Jellybean. He certainly would, agreed Sidney. Lock-em-up Louis was Miss Myrtle's favourite character in the class storybooks. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock precisely, Jellybean and the other children would put their things away whilst Miss Myrtle put her cowboy hat on. Then they listened to exciting stories about this famous sheriff and his band of cowboy helpers and the good guys gang. Maybe we should have a gang too, said Jellybean thoughtfully. So The Save Our Rice Pudding gang met for the first time that evening in Granny Bud's kitchen. There were 2 members, Jelly Bean and Sidney Wink. "What would Lock-em-up Louie do first?" asked Sidney. "He'd ask questions," replied Jelly Bean. "Like, who is the evil mastermind behind the robberies?" "Oh, yes," said Sidney Wink. "Then he'd look for clues." Said Jelly Bean. "But before we can look for clues, we need to find out exactly what happened." So they went to find Granny Bud, who was being looked after by Mrs. Little and Mrs. Grinchful. "I just fancied a treat," said Granny Bud, who was still very frightened. "So I opened a tin of rice pudding." Then Granny Bud described how she'd heard a dog barking outside her back door. But this was a strange bark, a howling bark, a sickening bark. Granny Bud loved dogs, so she'd gone to see if anything was the matter. "The dog rushed past me, then 2 masked men forced me into the stockroom and tied me up." Granny Bud shuddered. "Was it an angry black dog with froth round its mouth?" asked Jelly Bean. "Yes," said Granny Bud. "But how did you know that?" "I didn't," said Jelly Bean. "But there was an angry black dog at Mrs. Grinchful's just before her rice pudding went missing." "Perhaps that's a clue," said Sidney excitedly. "What if the black dog sniffs out the rice pudding and then the thieves come and steal it?" "Maybe," said Detective Cuffham, who had arrived to help with the investigation. "And it's not just happening in Snitchy Pike." So far, the thieves had stolen every tin of rice pudding they could find. Now this was a problem, but the rice pudding makers at the rice pudding factory could buy some rice, milk, sugar and butter and make some more. "And when they make more tins of rice pudding," said Sidney, "the rice pudding thieves will probably try to steal them." "Yes," said Jelly Bean, "which means we've got to catch the thieves red-handed before they really hurt someone." Then Detective Cuffham told Jelly Bean and Sidney that the stolen tins were often dumped, unopened, at the side of the road. "Why would anyone steal rice pudding if they weren't going to eat it?" asked Sidney. But Detective Cuffham didn't know the answer to that. "Was there anything strange about the tins?" asked Jelly Bean. "Funny you should say that," said Detective Cuffham. "There was." Then he explained, and they all thought and thought and thought, until Jelly Bean finally came up with a plan. "I'd never have had an idea like that in a month of Sundays," said Detective Cuffham. "Well, it might not work," said Jelly Bean, "but it's got to be worth a try." By the following week, everything was ready. Jelly Bean had put a notice in the paper. "There will be a rice pudding party in the kitchen at Curlew Cottage, Snitchy Pike Village, next Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock. Everyone is very welcome." The driver of the old dirty purple van was seething with anger when he saw Jelly Bean's notice. "A rice pudding party? But that's impossible." Then he turned and glared at the black dog. "Stupid animal!" he roared. "This is your fault. You were supposed to find all the tins of rice pudding. Fail me this time," he said in a very menacing way, "and you're finished." By 2 o'clock the following Saturday, everything at Curlew Cottage was ready. Mrs. Grinchful had disguised Mr. Grinchful in his best red tracksuit so that he looked like a sign. Then she'd hung him over the gate. Sidney had written a notice and stuck it on Mr. Grinchful's ear. "This way for rice pudding," it said. Outside the kitchen, a tree, which looked remarkably like Jelly Bean in disguise, was trying not to quake with fear. What if his plan went dreadfully wrong? Someone could get badly hurt, and it would be all his fault. "I think something's happening," whispered Sidney, who was on the lookout. And she was right. The angry black dog was coming up the garden path, and it was sniffing the air. Moments later, the black dog passed by, and as it did so, it gave a sickening howl. "Oh!" Then it sniffed the air again and headed towards the open kitchen door. Jellybean held his breath. His plan seemed to be working. Rice pudding didn't just come in tins from the factory. Mrs. Little had made some, and the black dog thought it was tinned rice pudding and was leading the thieves right to it. "Ready, everyone?" whispered Jellybean, who was a bit uncomfortable because his legs were on either side of the roof and the chimney was digging into his bottom. "Ready?" whispered Sidney.
Ready?
whispered Detective Cuffham. "Ready!" whispered the others, who were hiding in the kitchen. And a few moments later, the two thieves and the driver of the old dirty purple van crept up the garden path. Then the thieves slunk into the kitchen whilst the driver stayed on guard outside.
Oh no,
whispered Detective Cuffham in Jellybean's ear. He'd recognised the driver. It was Cruncher Macready, and he was very dangerous. Jellybean gulped. He was trying to be brave, but it wasn't easy. But then he had a thought. Hadn't he told Miss Trentwood Dunbody Tootle Smith in the mental arithmetic test that he would never allow a wicked cake stealer to steal his cakes? And if he was brave enough to face a cake stealer, then he had to be brave enough to catch the rice pudding thieves. Moments later, the black dog ran out of the kitchen, followed by the two masked men, who were carrying an enormous dish of rice pudding. Cruncher Macready couldn't believe his eyes. The rice pudding was not in a tin.
"This is useless," he hissed. "I've told you before, only tins of Rizzler's rice pudding are any good to me."
Then he aimed a vicious kick in the direction of the terrified black dog. "Oh, no, you don't," said Jellybean, as he whizzed Granny Bud's magic teeth through the air. And then the magic teeth bit Cruncher Macready on the bottom. And then Jellybean stuck one of his ginormous feet out. And then Cruncher Macready and the rice pudding thieves tripped over it. And then Mr. Little caught the enormous dish of rice pudding. And then Detective Cuffham arrested the villains. And then the black dog wasn't frothing at the mouth with anger. He was black, with rice pudding round his mouth. And he'd been howling because he was sick of rice pudding. So Granny Bud kept him. And whilst Mrs. Little made hot chocolate to celebrate, Jellybean and Sidney Wink told everyone about Cruncher Macready's wicked plan. Detective Cuffham told us that the rice pudding tins dumped at the side of the road had a bit of their labels missing, said Jellybean. And all the labels were from tins of Rizzler's rice pudding. Ah, said Mr. Little. So if Cruncher Macready wanted the labels, there must have been something special on them. Yes, said Sidney. And Jellybean rang the Rizzler's rice pudding factory to find out what it was. Cruncher Macready was very, very rich, but he was also very, very, very mean. He didn't like spending any of his own money, and he needed a new van. There was a competition to win a van on part of the Rizzler's rice pudding labels, said Sidney. Oh, I see, said Mr. Grinchful, who had been taken off the gate and was drinking hot chocolate through a straw. He thought that if he had all the labels, then no one else could enter the competition, and he would win the van. Exactly, said Jellybean. Then Granny Bud said well done to Jellybean and Sidney, though it sounded like, well run, Jellybean and Rinny, because her magic teeth were still in Cruncher Macready's bottom. Of course, the Save Our Rice Pudding Gang members got a bravery award and their picture in the newspaper. Mrs. Little had the photo framed and kept it by her bedside. You couldn't see much of Jellybean, but it was a lovely shot of his new red shoes. And back at school, Miss Trentwood Dunbody Tootle Smith apologised to Jellybean for not believing in a triangular Mr. Grinchful. Then she congratulated him for having such clever feet.
Pah!
said Archibald Trumps crossly.
My feet are the cleverest in the school.
Oh, really? said Miss Trentwood Dumbody Tootle-Smith, who still liked to have the last word. Well then, kindly ask them to stay in at playtime and work out what 8 times 11 plus 90 minus 3,000 is. So whilst Archibald Trumps worked on his difficult sum, all the other school children thanked Jellybean and Sidney Wink for saving their rice pudding. Then they formed an orderly queue behind Miss Myrtle, because she wanted first go at being tossed up and down in Jellybean's jumper. And did Archibald Trumps change his ways? No. But the next time there were huge puddles in the playground. He did have to change his trousers, because somehow or other they got very, 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 very wet. The end. Jellybean Little and the Rice Pudding Thieves by Carol Donockley, read by Viv Moules.